Please, James Hansen, come and have a seat on our stage. Welcome on board. And thank you very much for being with us tonight. Shall I let you introduce?
I don't think this gentleman needs too much of an introduction by way of biography, but I will tell you a little personal story and something that relates to the integrity and the strength of conviction. As you probably know, this is Jim's first COP meeting ever. I thought long and hard, and I got my courage up and sent him an email and said, Jim, essentially, if there is ever a time when you are needed, it's now. I didn't have to wait too long for that reply. A couple of days later, when he was in, I think it was San Diego at a conference, some elderly scientist dubbed him as the conscious of the scientific community. And there's no other way to introduce him than that. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. That scientist was Walter Munk, who's now in his 90s and a remarkable oceanographer. Well, I just realized today that I was giving a talk this evening. I thought there was going to be a showing of Merchants of Doubt, and I was going to do some Q&A after it, but I guess I'm also supposed to give a talk. So I quickly put something together, and it will not be a polished presentation, but I think I can make my bottom line clear. And how can I move charts? I just raise a hand, I guess. Okay.
I'm going to get out of your way.
You know, there are three potential injustices. Could I go back one? So I need to decide whether we're talking about climate justice and government honesty or injustice and dishonesty. Okay. Now, the go to the next one, please. I'm sure you realize the biggest injustice is the one intergenerational issue. Our parents did not know that they were causing a problem for future generations, but we can only pretend that we don't know. That's why we have to have policies that will actually address this. And that's why we have to look at what they're talking about at this conference. The second one is north-south, where I'm not sure I have a chart or not, but most of the emissions have been from the north, but the biggest impacts are at low latitudes. I even have a paper that's in the process of being published, so I can't really show the results, but we show that the changes are much larger, actually, at low latitudes. And they're already feeling effects, and that is making it actually uncomfortable to live at the lowest latitudes. And so that's a second area of injustice. And then, of course, it's one species is causing all of the change. Millions of other species, we potentially can cause the extermination of a quarter to a half of the other species by the end of this century, according to the last IPCC report, and there's a fairly good basis for that estimate. Okay, let's go to the next one. So what I'm going to say, if it's not sufficiently coherent, I would suggest that you look at the most recent document that I sent out, which I think was called Isolation of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Now go to the next one. And let me just mention one, I'll just show one figure from a paper which is also in the process of being reviewed and published. What we show is that the ice melt coming from Greenland and Antarctica will have a very big effect, and it's not included in the IPCC models. And we argue that the rate of freshwater discharge from these ice sheets is a very nonlinear process, which is better characterized by a doubling time rather than a more linear process. And when we look at the data, the period for which we have accurate data for the mass loss from Greenland and Antarctica, it's like a decadal doubling time, which would mean that within 4 to 5 decades, you've got multimeter sea level rise. And the surface manifestation of that is a cooling around Antarctica, and that the fresh water makes the vertical column of the ocean more stable. So the usual mechanism by which the Southern Ocean, brings heat up, which is expelled to space, is cut off by this freshwater lens, and instead the heat melts the base, the ice shelves, the tongues of ice that come out from Antarctica into the ocean. Now we observe, in fact, this is happening, that the ice shelves are melting faster and faster, and we also observe that it's beginning to cool around the region where the ice discharge is the largest. And it's less certain how soon the North Atlantic will begin to cool. In fact, it's the last few years it has cooled, but we don't know if that's an oscillation or if that's really the beginning of the effect of the fresh water coming off of Greenland. But that, if we let that happen, that the fresh water become at a rate that's big enough to shut down the North Atlantic Deepwater Formation, the way Wally Broker hypothesized decades ago, then all hell breaks loose, because you're cooling the northern latitudes while the tropical latitudes are continuing to get warmer because of the greenhouse gases. And that increased temperature gradient drives much stronger storms. Let's go to the next one. Now, you know, the current emissions, they'll say, well, China is now the biggest emitter. But the climate change is not caused by current emissions. It's caused by the cumulative emissions over time. And those cumulative emissions, the United States is responsible for more than a quarter. Europe is responsible for more than a quarter. China for 10%, India 3%, and so on. But that even is an exaggeration of the effect of the developing countries. Could I have the next one? If you look at it on a per capita basis, United Kingdom is first, and the United States almost the same, and Germany is third. But China is an order of magnitude smaller, a contribution to climate change. And India is barely visible. Their contribution is so small. Could I have the next one? And we are threatening many species for many different reasons. Humans are just sort of taking over the planet. But if you combine that with shifting climate zones, which we will have if we continue on business as usual with fossil fuel emissions, we will cause the extermination of a large number of species. Could I have the next one? Now, we can actually quantify what is needed. If we want to stabilize climate, we need to have, you need to restore the planet's energy balance. What will you do when you add CO2 and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere is you reduce the heat radiation to space because they absorb infrared heat radiation. So there's more energy then coming in from the sun than there is energy going out, and so the planet gets warmer. But the planet has only partially responded to the gases we've put up in the atmosphere, and we can now measure how far it is out of balance because different nations of the world cooperated in spreading more than 3,000 Argo floats around the ocean. They dive down into the ocean because this heat has to go into the ocean. The atmosphere is very thin. It has a very small heat capacity, and the continents have a very low thermal conductivity, so the thermal wave only penetrates a few tens of meters. So most of the energy goes into the ocean. We can now measure that could I have the next one? The planet is out of balance. There's more, the heat content of the ocean is increasing. It tells us that we've only felt about half of the climate change due to the gases that are already up there. And we're still increasing more and more. It also tells us what we would have to do if we wanted to stabilize climate. And we've already increased the temperature back to the maximum and slightly above the maximum of the Holocene, which is the current climate, 10,000-year climate period that we've been living in, that civilization developed in. So if we want to avoid shooting way out of the Holocene, we need to restore the planet's energy balance. Well, once we know that it's out of balance by about 0.6 of a watt per meter squared, that tells us that other things being equal, we would have to reduce the CO2 from 400 parts per million to about 350 parts per million, which is the source of Bill McKibben's name of his organization. That's possible because the ocean and the biosphere and the soil will take up some of that CO2 if we give it time, provided we reduce our emissions fast enough. Could I have the next one? And what it means is that we can only afford to burn a small amount of additional fossil fuels. We've only burned a small fraction of the total fossil fuels in the ground. And the science is crystal clear. We can't burn all of that stuff without creating eventually an ice-free planet and sea level 250 feet higher. So we know that we can only burn a relatively small amount of additional fossil fuels. Could I have the next one? The next chart. But what's actually happening is that not only are we continuing to burn, this is just the rate at which we're burning. This is energy, but it's mostly fossil fuels. It's almost all coal, oil, and gas. Could I have the next one? So here's the fundamental problem is, and by the way, I've learned, I worked for NASA for some decades, and the highest levels of NASA would always tell me when I went to Washington, make sure you only talk about the science. Don't say anything about policy. That's not your business. What I learned finally was the reason is that they want to make decisions which are not rational if you're really looking out after the, for the good of everybody on the long term. And I think that scientists can look at problems. I think scientists are trained to be objective. I've decided to ignore that issue. But looking at this problem rationally, it's very clear. The fundamental problem is that we're going to keep burning fossil fuels as long as they appear to be the cheapest energy. These developing countries, they have just as much right as we did to burn fossil fuels to lift their people out of poverty. But fossil fuels are not really the cheapest energy because they don't include their cost to society. And So to address the problem, we need to add a fee to fossil fuels. And you can't do that instantly. It would cause economic chaos if you suddenly quadrupled the price of fossil fuels or something. But you can gradually increase a fee on fossil fuels. So could I have the next one? And furthermore, I argue that fee should be, the money that's collected should be distributed to the public, an equal amount to every legal resident of the country. That way it actually spurs the economy. And an economy is more efficient if the prices are honest. Right now, fossil fuel prices are not honest. They're partially subsidized, but mainly they're just not paying their cost to society. The human health impact of air pollution and water pollution alone would make a large increase in the price of fossil fuels. You have to pay the bill yourself if your child gets asthma. And then there's the climate impact, which is going to be enormous if we allow this to continue to go on. And I think the only viable international approach is to say we need a carbon fee. If a few small number of the major players, those being China, the United States, the European Union, would agree to have a rising carbon fee, then you could make it near global easily. They would say that we're going to put a border duty on countries that don't have an equivalent carbon fee, and that would be a huge incentive for the other countries to have an equivalent fee so they can collect the money themselves rather than have us collect it at the borders. So that, unfortunately, okay, let's go to the next one. Now, and actually a lot of people are beginning to understand this. And so, as Christiana says, a lot of people are saying we need a carbon price and then investment would be much easier and life would, but she says life is much more complex than that. And so she says we're not going to do that. Well, if that's the case, then those you're not going to, what she is saying and what I hear the other international players saying is, oh, we're going to do something, we're going to have, Angela Merkel is going around the world telling people, oh, do like us, we have a cap-and-trade scheme. Well, I made a trip. I'd written a letter to Merkel in 2008. And I thought, well, she's a trained physicist. She can understand logic. And so I wanted to meet with her, but it ended up her advisor, science advisor, said, oh, it's better if you, this letter was going to be published. It was translated to German. It's going to be published in Die Zeit, the leading newspaper. But the science advisor asked me to come over and speak with the government, thinking, when I got this, but what happened? Could I have the next one? Well, what happened was that they simply said, well, it's their policy is cap and trade, and I would say, well, what's the cap on India? And then he'd say, oh, we'll tighten our carbon cap. Well, the problem isn't Germany's carbon cap, because Germany's now a fairly small portion, 1% or something of global emissions. So how much they tighten the cap? They should do it, of course, since they're one of the three top contributors to the problem. But that's not going to solve the problem. You have to have a global approach. In science, when you do an experiment and it's carefully controlled and observed and you see the result, you expect that if you do the same experiment again, you'll get the same result. Well, what they're talking about here is the same as the Kyoto Protocol. No global agreement for to make the price of fossil fuels honest. Instead, get somebody to have a cap, and then why don't you get this other country to do it also? Well, you can't do it that way because what is the effect? If you reduce your emissions in Germany or someplace else, that makes the fuel less precious. It reduces the price, and someone else will burn it. As long as the fossil fuels are the cheapest energy, somebody's going to burn it. And so reducing it someplace with a cap, you can't, there is no such thing as a global cap, but you could have a global common fee. And unless we do that, we're just rearranging the deck chairs. It's not solving the problem. Do I have any more? Let's. Yeah. So unless someone can get through, I tried to. I wanted to make this same argument with President Obama, and my wife and I wrote a letter to him, but I couldn't get it delivered. But I don't think he understands this, and I think it's a problem. This is scientific. This is rational analysis of the problem, and if now what is happening in Paris is that it's been agreed we're not going to let another Copenhagen happen. We're going to go away from this meeting with everybody clapping each other on the back and saying, "Oh, we're really doing something now." I don't buy it. If all they're talking about is the same old stuff, they're going to get the same old answer. I mean, not to say that there aren't a few positive things happening. The investment fund to try to find cleaner energies and make them competitive with fossil fuels is something we should have done 25 years ago, because we knew there was going to be this problem. So it's useful that some wealthy people are willing to throw some money at the research and development. But so there's some positive things, but basically it's still the same old story. So I don't care what they say on television tomorrow or next week. If this is all they're doing, do I have any? I might have one more. Is that right? No, maybe that was the last one. Okay. So anyway, I'm sorry to sound negative, but this is if we go away from here and let them get away with this. We're good. In 10 years, we'll be coming back, and it's the same thing. You're going to see global emissions continue up, and then I don't see how young people can solve the problem. We'll have pushed the system too far. The ocean getting too warm, it means that we're going to lose the ice sheets, the most vulnerable ones in Antarctica, and that means several meters of sea level rise. And that means you're going to have hundreds of millions of refugees. We're going to have refugees from low latitudes because the low latitudes are just going to become less and less comfortable for people to live. And you get more extreme droughts. And so the food supply is limited. But the biggest thing will be if we let the ice sheets collapse, and there are glaciologists who are warning us every time, it's getting a little faster. But that it's important that we get started on this downward path. And the policies that are being talked about are not going to do that.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much. Well, I don't think you're negative. You're bringing a solution. This fee is a solution.
Yeah, well, there is an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby,
Yeah.
which
We're
has
with it.
as its sole objective this educating politicians and the public about the merits of a fee and dividend. And you know what? They've done an economic study that shows if you had $10 a ton going up $10 a ton, at the end of 10 years in the United States, it reduces emissions 30%, creates 3 million jobs, and increases the GNP because it makes the economy more efficient if you
Exactly.
have honest prices.